In Victorian England, hundreds of women risked prison by marrying a second or even a seventh husband, while their first husband lived just miles away, all because the law made escape nearly impossible. A wife seeking a divorce had to prove cruelty or abandonment, and even then, she was often left penniless and without her children. The courts prosecuted a few, but records suggest thousands slipped through the cracks. What truly drove these women to collect husbands, and what happened to the families left in their wake? A married woman in Victorian England stood on legal ground as unstable as quicksand. The law of coverture meant that the moment she wed, her property, her earnings, even her children, belonged by right to her husband. If he vanished or turned violent, her options narrowed to near nothing. Divorce, after 1857, was theoretically possible. For a wife, it was never enough. She had to prove not just adultery, but also cruelty, desertion, or incest. Most could not afford the legal battle, even if she succeeded. Legal separation stripped her of income and often her children as well. Until the Married Women's Property Act of 1870, a wife's wages and inheritance belonged to her husband. And only in 1882 did the law finally allow married women to truly own property in their own names. Before these reforms, a woman deserted by her husband was left without support, unable to remarry without risking prosecution, and with no right to claim her children or her own labor. Many found themselves in workhouses, separated from their families, or forced to rely on charity. For countless women, the only way to rebuild a life was to take another husband, sometimes while the first still lived, sometimes in hope that he was lost forever. The law's indifference to their survival turned bigamy from a scandal into a last resort. By the mid-19th century, the machinery meant to track marriages was riddled with gaps. Civil registration, introduced in 1837, was supposed to record every marriage, but compliance was spotty for decades, especially among the poor. Until 1875, registration was not strictly enforced, and many unions slipped by with only a faded entry in a parish ledger, if that. Names were misspelled, records went missing, and in industrial towns, overworked registrars rarely checked for earlier marriages. Mobility added another layer of confusion. As families moved between booming factory towns or set out for distant colonies, their histories vanished behind them. A woman might marry in Sunderland, move to Manchester, and then to Liverpool, each time presenting herself as a widow or a maiden. With no centralized database and only handwritten ledgers tying her to a previous life, her past could be erased by a train ticket or a steamship voyage. By the 1880s, courts in England and Wales prosecuted over 200 bigamy cases each year, but that was only the visible tip. Historians estimate the true number ran 10 times higher, hidden by the ease with which a determined woman or man could slip across parish lines or national borders. Judges and police knew the system's weaknesses. They saw the same names, with slight variations, drifting through their courtrooms. The structure of record-keeping itself, designed to preserve order, instead created shadows where bigamy flourished. Mary Ann Cotton stood in the dock at Durham in 1865, accused of marrying a second man while her first husband was still alive. She told the court she believed her husband had died in a mining accident, a story not uncommon in the coal fields, where men vanished underground and news traveled slowly. The judge, perhaps seeing the desperation behind her actions, handed down a sentence of 6 months' imprisonment. It was a lighter penalty than many expected, shaped by the harsh realities of the time. Cotton's first husband had left her years before, moving to another county for work. And with no word from him, she faced life alone with children to feed. Remarriage, even if risky, meant shelter and survival. But in Cotton's case, this early conviction was only the beginning. The court's leniency missed what would later become clear: that for some bigamy was not just a means to survive, but a first step on a darker path. The system's blind spot left space for consequences no one in that courtroom could have imagined. Elizabeth Chicken's story unfolded across the industrial North, where crowded towns and shifting populations made it easy to vanish and begin again. Between 1851 and 1876, she married 7 men, never staying long in one place and rarely using the same name twice. Parish records show her as Elizabeth Chichester in Newcastle, Eliza Chicken in Sunderland, and even Mrs. Clark in Durham. Each alias was a fresh start, each marriage a new opportunity. Her preferred targets were widowers with children, men who needed a wife to keep house and restore order. She would settle in for a year or two, become indispensable, and then slip away with whatever valuables she could carry. Sometimes a watch, sometimes savings tucked in a tea tin. In the absence of centralized records, few suspected her past until 2 of her husbands, both selling produce at the same market, recognized her at a distance. The confrontation drew a crowd, and word spread quickly through the town. Arrested and tried as a habitual criminal, Elizabeth Chicken received 7 years of penal servitude. Her case revealed how easily mobility and the gaps in parish record-keeping allowed bigamy to flourish on a scale that startled even seasoned magistrates. Between 1865 and 1869, Sarah Jane Robinson's marriages were no accident of circumstance. She orchestrated a string of unions across Manchester, Salford, and Oldham, each time presenting herself as a widow or a deserted wife. Her real aim was not companionship, but control over her new husband's assets. After the wedding, Robinson would persuade her key spouse to grant her power of attorney or to add her name to his bank account. Within weeks, she emptied accounts, sold household goods, and in one case even arranged the sale of a small terraced house, pocketing the proceeds before vanishing. 4 men found themselves abandoned and penniless, their savings gone. The paper trail was impossible to ignore. Bank ledgers, pawn receipts, and legal documents all pointed to deliberate fraud. It was not until George Dawson, her 4th husband, grew suspicious and alerted police that the full extent of her crimes came to light. At the Lancashire Assizes in 1869, the court heard testimony from each of her husbands. The judge, citing her calculated deception, sentenced Robinson to 10 years of penal servitude, a sentence far harsher than most, reserved for those who turned marriage into a tool for systematic theft. Children born to bigamous unions often found themselves erased from both law and family. The courts deemed these marriages void, leaving sons and daughters with no right to inherit, their claims denied by fathers who could simply refuse paternity. Poor law files from the 1860s and the 1870s show a steady trickle of such children entering the workhouse, their names penciled into registers alongside the word illegitimate. When mothers were imprisoned, siblings were split and scattered. Some were apprenticed out, others left to survive in the dormitories. Inheritance that might have lifted them from poverty was lost with a single court ruling. For these children, the consequences of a mother's desperate choice were lifelong. No claim to a father's name, no share of family property, and a future that too often began behind workhouse walls. Courtrooms across Victorian England echoed with a mixture of condemnation and reluctant mercy. Judges often spoke of the unhappy circumstances facing women accused of bigamy, especially first offenders who claimed desertion or believed a husband dead. For these women, sentences could be as light as a few months, with judges remarking on the hardship and lack of options for the accused. But when bigamy crossed into calculated fraud, when a woman like Sarah Jane Robinson drained a husband's savings or forged documents, punishments grew severe. 10 years of penal servitude was not uncommon for those who used marriage as a tool for theft. Class shaped every outcome. Working-class women, unable to afford legal defense, faced harsher terms, while wealthier defendants sometimes escaped with fines or public scolding. Newspapers fanned public sympathy for struggling wives, urging leniency, yet also demanded harsh justice for repeat offenders. The law's response was never fixed, but it was always shadowed by the realities of poverty and social expectation. Victorian laws forced desperate choices. Choices echoed wherever legal barriers still trap people in dangerous marriages. Today, 1 in 3 women worldwide still face restricted divorce rights. Until freedom is universal, survival sometimes breaks the rules. These stories remind us the law's intent means little if justice is denied.